Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Beyond Seizure Counts, Expanding Endpoints in Pediatric Epilepsy Trials. My name is Sonia Hunt, and it's my pleasure to be your X Talks moderator for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and this presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers, and this is also going to be a lively roundtable discussion. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. Now, this chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming to those who register on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Worldwide Clinical Trials who developed the content for this presentation. Worldwide Clinical Trials is a leading global contract research organization that works in partnership with biotechnology and pharmaceutical companies to create customized solutions that advance new medications from discovery to reality. Their full-service clinical development capabilities include bioanalytical laboratory services and phase 1 through 4 clinical trials, as well as post-approval and real-world evidence studies. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. And first, I'd like to introduce you to Jayetta Hacker. There she is, Jayetta. She is the board chair and co-founder of the International SCN8A Alliance, Deep Connections, and the Instone Project. Jayetta is an economist who specialized in independent public policy analysis and held several positions with the National Academy of Sciences. Jayetta served for 25 years with the Congressional Research Arm, the Government Accountability Office. And next, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Gabi Conacher. She is an executive director and co-founder of the Decoding Development Epilepsies. And there she is. Hi, Gabi. Home to the International SCNA 8 Alliance, Deep Connections, and the Instone Project. Gabi has nearly 20 years of experience in advocating for advancing public health. Gabi earned her Master of Public Health from Columbia's University Mailman School of Public Health. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, and she is Dr. Jessica Duaz. She is a Senior Medical Director in Clinical Development for the Neurology Pipeline at Neurocrine Biosciences. Hello there, Jessica. She is a geneticist and pediatrician and did her medical training at Johns Hopkins. In Academy, she developed several centers of excellence, including translational, clinical research, and drug development. And next is Julianne Mills. She is a seasoned scientist in the world of clinical research. Hi, Julianne. With over 20 years of experience, Julianne's mission is simple but powerful: to make real difference for people battling rare diseases. At Worldwide, she is the go-to person for creating smart, streamlined plans that help bring new treatments to those in need. Now, with the introductions out of the way, it's now my pleasure to pass the mic over to Julianne. So, Julianne, when you're ready, you may begin.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. It's a real privilege to be with you today and to be with these speakers. As we get into the talk today, we're going to talk a lot about the work that Gabi and Jayetta are doing to support the Instone Project. So I'd like to level set today by just asking Jayetta if you could say a few words about the Instone Project. And I have a slide to share about that. So let me get that going. Make sure this works.
Thanks so much, Julianne.
Yeah, thank you.
This is really a simple overview that basically, as a family of a severely affected child and a advocacy leader, we were clearly aware of the profound limitations of existing outcome measures in capturing the abilities or improvement in severely affected individuals. We went through it, whether it was in trials, whether it was in research projects. All of these instruments, basically children are at the floor effect, and they're not captured, they're not seen, they're not measured. And the result is they're really being effectively excluded from research and from trials because they're not seen, they're not measured, and that their improvements, which may be small, which we call inch stones, but meaningful, they're just not being captured. And not only are they not seen, but as sponsors, it really is effectively impeding the ability to evaluate the impact, particularly of the more disease-modifying trials and interventions. So it's profoundly important both to the individuals and to sponsors that improvements be made in outcome measures for capturing small but important improvements. So basically, as advocates, we saw no one really comprehensively tackling this. And as an advocacy organization, we first scoped out the issue and then built a multidisciplinary team of researchers, of biotech and pharma companies who understood and prioritized this problem, patient advocacy organizations, and different specialties and leaders, and created the Inchstone Project 3 years ago, actually this month. It was a pre-competitive space. It was planned to be very rigorous and comprehensive, a 5-year plan to basically develop or adapt COAs that would capture the small but meaningful inch stones that are made in this population.
Congratulations, 3 years. That's pretty amazing. Sonia, if you don't mind, I'd like to go back to the group setting. Before, Gabi, I turn to you and ask you to share a little bit about, excuse me, the work that your team has done. I'd like to just sort of humanize this for a moment. And it just so happened on LinkedIn last night, I was messaging to my followers, whatever you call them, about this webinar that we're doing and how excited I was to speak with you. And Melody Keesor, who's from Cure LBSL, sent me a link. And I just want to read this because I think it provides that human side, which we all know, but I want to, again, level set for the audience. From a poster who says, at nearly 15 years, my child with a history of infantile spasms, DEE, IDD, ASD, used a fork for the first time last weekend. He initiated a game with his younger brother, attempted to make a basket and a basketball. He took interest in scribbling on a notebook with a crayon. My husband asked, "Where's Mama?" and he looked my way. These are the things he never did before. He recently started taking a new drug and weaned another drug a few weeks ago. Coincidence? I don't think so. This is the important part. His seizure count, which is the typical measure of treatment success, is about the same. Ask people with lived experience what outcomes matter to them. And I think that is a nice summation from a parent's perspective of all the work that the Inchstone Project is trying to do. So I know that you all can relate to that, but just wanted to share that with our audience as well. So Gabi, I'd like to ask you then, I mean, this is such an important need. What are some of the trends that we see in endpoints for complex rare epilepsies? And can you tie that back to the Inchstone? And again, I mean, because these patients aren't hitting milestones, right? We need to be measuring Inchstones. So if you can talk a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, and I'll also just kind of level set personally that, you know, my son Elliot he has SCN8A DEE. He's 12 years old, and just in the last year, he's been working on head control, right? And over the last year and a half, he's made immense progress, but it has been very, very slow. So he went from holding his head at, 90 degrees, to 70, to 50, to 40. And there's nobody asking about those kinds of progressions, but that has dramatically improved his quality of life. He has less aspiration, less pneumonias. So there's real value in these Inchstones. And I think that's really what's driving us here is the desire to not just capture what's very relevant for clinical reasons, but for, just like that quote from that family, what improves the quality of life for our families. And if it's being able to eat independently or communicate, whichever way they communicate, which very rarely is words in this population. And I think we all know that precision therapies require precision measurement. And and that's really kind of a tagline that we've been using for Inchstone Project, because the reality is that we have to know the audience we're working with, right? And if we are expecting typical tools that are used, that are, commonly used, that don't actually capture our children, who are often 3 and 4 and 5 standard deviations below the floor on these measures, then you're setting yourself up for failure, and not just for millions and millions of dollars they can invest in, but for families who may be on these treatments and are seeing progress and would be devastated if this went away and was not approved. So I think that's really one of the shifts, and we know that the world is moving more towards disease modifying therapies, to precision measurement, to precision therapies, and it's going to become more and more important that we can actually, on an individual level, be able to determine if there's, some impact from these challenges. And it's not just because it's a nice thing to do. The reality is that, there is law and policy that exists. If you look at FDA guidances, that trials must be rooted in and responsive to patient experience and priorities. And that is very much what we do at Inchstone. We are very much based on asking the community what it is they want, what they need, what their priorities are. We are just publishing a paper. It's soon to come out. Our team, we have an incredible team, as Jada mentioned. Dr. Ann Berg is one of our PIs. Dr. Jenny Downs is another PI. We've got Mary Wojnarowski, who's a psychologist. We've got Natasha Ludwig, who's a neuropsych, and we've got Rebecca Hammer, who's a teacher of the visually impaired, and we've got plenty of other people around us that are doing incredible work as well. But the reality is that that team is asking the right questions. They're asking the right questions of the right people, right? And we have everybody involved, and that's really critical, right? So this survey that we did recently, we heard from over 260 DEE caregivers about what their children can do. And I can tell you, as a mom who's been in clinical trials, I've never been able to say yes on these questionnaires. Can your child sit? No. Can your child grasp a toy for 10 seconds? Does your child respond to their name? Does your child? And for us to finally have the ability to say, yes, my kid can do that, and what better looks like, it's very powerful. And we got messages from families saying, this is the first time, you actually see my child. Our children are invisible so often. So I'll wrap up because I've been talking a lot, but essentially we know that with the explosion of genetic discovery and these rare epilepsies and DEEs that are being discovered, there's only going to be increased need to really be able to have tools that are suitable across disorders. There's people who've done amazing work on specific disorder-related tools, but our vision is that these are tools that can be used across disorders, so nobody has to continue to do one-by-one development of these tools. And we know that it's beyond seizures a lot of the time, right? What really matters. And we honestly can't assume that stopping seizures or even like fixing the gene actually cures the child or improves their quality of life. So we have to be willing to understand that maybe the treatments that are developed won't stop the seizures, but they could drastically improve quality of life. And we have to be able to measure that.
Yep. And I think the evidence that you and your team are putting together that shows that still matters to family is an important part of the conversation. And we'll later in the hour, we'll get into sort of where the regulators stand and payers stand on this. But I love your point about like, it's not just the right thing to do or a nice thing to do, it's required by regulations that we're capturing the community's insights into this. Thank you. Jessica, I want to give you a chance to speak a little bit what you're seeing on, and I know you're kind of wearing two hats in this webinar, about the types of assessments that we see used in epilepsy today and where that might be going into the future. And I'm not talking about sort of the instruments that Gabi was just mentioning, but specifically epilepsy, like seizure counts. Is it still diaries? I mean, are we still rooted in that, or where do you see that going in the future, either in clinical practice and or in clinical trials?
Yeah, well, I first want to say thank you so much for having me on. I'm humbled to be a part of this group. I think with seizures, the traditional way of thinking about it has been to look at seizure counts and counting either monthly seizure counts or daily seizure counts as an endpoint in clinical trials. And the challenge with that is that if you're talking about certain types of seizures, sometimes they're not clinically apparent, or it's very difficult to accurately count seizures if someone's having many seizures per day, or catching the seizures and getting an accurate count. There have been attempts to try to change from paper diaries to the tuberous sclerosis community has done a good job of implementing some more digital tools to measure seizures, but it's still imperfect. There's a lot more use of and hope that use of quantitative EEG will help us to understand what's happening. But as we learn more about quantitative EEG, it's not so much the epileptiform activity that we're picking up, but a background activity that really is probably more tied to the global disorder as opposed to, all of the other things that often go along with the seizures in these developmental epileptic encephalopathies, like, concerns about development and cognition, or concerns about motor development. So I think what we're going to actually see is a movement away from trying to measure seizures and looking at more of the other features of these disorders, focusing on improvements in development. I'd really like to see, more individually focused outcome measures that look at where the individual patient is at the start of the trial, really getting the input from advocates, including caretakers, parents, but also, school and community, to say what would really make this particular individual's quality of life improved, and see more focused measures that can, like goal attainment scaling is an example of that, where we start to really focus on the individual and where they are at the beginning of the trial, and not so much try to put everybody into the same basket of we're going to measure seizures. There's definitely some challenges there, but I hope that that's the direction that for many of these DEEs, where they're very heterogeneous and, different individuals are at different places in terms of their development, where certain things would be very meaningful to one person, but is not what would improve the quality of life in a meaningful way for another person.
It's a really good point. We're seeing a lot more in the rare disease space as a move to not only personalized clinical outcomes assessments, but also composite scoring that is includes many of these things. So thank you. I appreciate your comments. And Jada, that's a really nice segue into learning a little bit more about what Inchstone is doing to sort of broaden the scope of clinical outcomes assessments available to the community. Can you say a little bit about what your group has been doing in that area?
Absolutely, because that's the exciting part of how much has actually been achieved in these 3 years. As Gabi mentioned, it's a very competent and experienced multidisciplinary team. So the work has been very structured, rigorous, and all the work that we've done has been published in peer-reviewed journals. So we're not just having workshops or brainstorming or ideas, but really working with psychometricians, getting the right measurements. The first year, we actually, in addition to forming the groups and the kind of governance and communication and collaboration to run the project, we did an intense pilot with 10 individuals with SCN2A, and we had 5 major instruments, and quickly really made progress understanding both caregiver priorities and the performance of these major existing tools, and documented the failure that I'd outlined right at the beginning to capture what was meaningful and prioritized by families. And that just that 2A pilot led to 4 major publications, including an important one that was a review of the 4 PFDD guidances that FDA put out, and the challenges that were clearly critical to accommodate in the severely affected population, that you couldn't assume they could see, you couldn't assume they could move, you couldn't assume that they could understand questions that were designed for a more typical performing group. The second and third year, we expanded the effort to get more generalizable data on caregiver priorities and the performance of these instruments, doing the Parent Speak survey that Gabi mentioned earlier, where we got not only over 260 families, but it represented more than 24 etiologies. So we were getting far more representative data on priorities and experience and performance of existing instruments in the 5 modules that we created. And what we've been putting out is really unique data on domains that are most important to families and the impactful to children and the families and their priorities for improvement. And then the increments of change, that meaningful change issue. You can know what's important, but what's the meaningful change? And that's just really critical to be teasing out in a rigorous way, which we're doing both with quantitative data and qualitative data. We've got a lot of experiences like the family you reported on. You hear in those stories, and if you aggregate it from enough families, we have new data from the qualitative analysis of families' responses about those small but meaningful increments.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Jayetta, but can you say what those 5 domains are? I think they would help illustrate sort of, where are we making the measures?
Well, the domains that are, it looked at all the major comorbidities. So there were questions about abilities, performance improvement, of everything from fine and gross motor skills and sleep challenges, autoimmune challenges. So it was all of the complexities separate from the seizures that affect so many of the population. It really goes to the point, though, that the amazing result of this comprehensive data was that there was outstanding evidence and consistency of a priority for communication, independent of etiology, independent of age of the child, even independent of severity, because we had new measures of the severity, and there could be some that are more like Elliot that are so profound that, at 12 years old, his successes are in head control, where there are others that are much further along, but are also needing small measurements. So that is really the focus moving forward on developing a new tool or adapted instrument, and it's going to focus on communication, which is very, very different, as Gabi mentioned, for this population. And we are really scoping out the strategy to actually come up with this new instrument this year, and then move on to a validation phase so that we're ready to bring it as exploratory or secondary outcomes in actual trials of some of our partners in the project.
That's fantastic. Again, congratulations. And this, the concept of communication is something that I have heard from many rare disease communities. The frustration that families feel because they don't know if their kiddo's in pain, are they hungry? Like, they're clearly distressed, but what is it? And I think that that's obviously a real unmet need, and being able to measure that is going to be really important. Jessica, I want to go back to you quickly, because these measures, it's very challenging, right? And should they be qualitative? Should they be quantitative? And they also need to be practical, right? You mentioned earlier about remote ECGs, or excuse me, EEGs. I've heard from some families that my kid has touch sensitivity. There's no way they're wearing anything, right? That's just not going to be practical. I've heard from families when it came to seizure counts, like, oh, we'll just put a camera in the kiddo's room and we can measure seizures there. And the parents got really frustrated with that because they sleep with their kiddos in case anything happens. And the medical community has already invaded so much of their lives. Like the bedroom was the one last place of sanctuary, and no way are you putting a camera in there. It's just a bridge too far. So in addition to developing the measures, how we measure, quantitative or qualitative, I think is also part of the challenge. I was wondering if you could say a little bit in your experience about what you've seen works best or is easiest to do in practice. And Jayada mentioned this meaningful, clinically meaningful outcomes. Is there a term of art that we need to be aware of, or how is that referred to in regulatory and clinical realms?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of whether it needs to be qualitative or quantitative, I actually think, thinking about composite endpoints where we have both is probably the most important direction to move in. And there's been a lot of advancement in technology, from being able to do EEGs at home, as you mentioned, being able to do video-based assessments and having some validity to the way that those are captured in the home environment. And then there's a lot of improvement in digital health technologies, either wearables or even within the home. There's some ethical questions about some of the things you mentioned in terms of invasiveness in the home, but there's been advancement in using things like the same signals that we use for Wi-Fi to measure things like sleep and breathing and even autonomic function without having to put anything directly onto the person to be able to measure those things. And one of the challenges that we've faced, and I'll mention a few examples where I think this has been overcome, is that when we put some of these technologies on the individuals participating in the trials, it's hard to make that connection of why is a change, for example, in breathing important for that particular individual from a quality of life standpoint. Different, for example, breathing maybe is a little easier to connect to quality of life, but say there's different patterns of breathing, but it doesn't actually affect the way the individual, form, functions, lives in the world. And what we really need is some kind of connected endpoint like Jayada and Gabi are working on that connects the two together. So while you're collecting the quantitative data at very specific time points, when you're collecting that, to collect some kind of a measure that's very related to quality of life to show how they move together. And that's where you come to a composite endpoint where you hopefully see something that's actually quantitative, that's predictive of a change in the qualitative and the quality of life, that then you could present that data to regulators and bring forward an endpoint that makes sense. And we're seeing this happen with lots of different biomarkers, particularly in the lysosomal storage disease communities, where you're seeing, glycosphingosine, for example, or different toxic substrates or metabolites that build up, and showing that there's a change in those that does over time qualitatively make a difference in terms of the patient's quality of life. But we know with a lot of those, like for MPS1, there's a change in the biomarker that precedes seeing some of those positive changes. And there's been, especially recently working with regulators, particularly the FDA, there's been movement in terms of being able to use those as surrogate endpoints to go for things like accelerated approval to get these treatments to more individuals who we think the earlier we get them these precision therapies, the more benefit they may have over time. So I think that's the direction that things are going. And it's really important to be, as you know, to be working with people to think about how are we going to put that qualitative together, or more subjective measure together with something qualitative. Because I think the challenge is, you know, a lot of these, even CGI scales are thought that are filled out by clinicians, you know, really depends on the clinician experience. These are clinical global impression scales, you know, are is based on the experience of the clinician of the severity of the disorder, where they might rate everybody that they see. And so you end up with, you know, fairly different ratings depending on the experience of the physician. So having something quantitative where you're pointing to a number is something that I think is important. And the way that we think about this is called minimally clinically important difference, or MCID. And it's really interesting. I've worked with several working groups to try to develop an MCID for things like the Bailey, which are being used in a lot of DEEs outside the age range for which it's validated. And it comes back to what Jayed and Gabi are talking about very clearly, which is that depending on where the individual is in their developmental trajectory, different things are important to different people. And so, you know, there are some things that come out very clearly as important: communication, toileting, feeding oneself, safety related concerns, you know, being able to stop at a curb, at a sidewalk, at a street, rather than, you know, run across the street or keep going. So there's definitely some very clear things that are related to quality of life for these individuals, but depending on where they are on the curve and what skill they're at, they may have on the Bailey 8 skills before they get to the one that's truly clinically meaningful to the family. And that, you know, that puts the MCID maybe 11 points versus someone who's right there. And the next skill is being able to indicate that they're going to be needing to go to the bathroom. And that changes 1 point to be able to be important for that family. So, so it's very hard to define these in these populations.
Those are great examples. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm heartened by your comments that the regulators are starting to get wind of this, or pay attention. And I know, Gabi, you guys just did a patient-focused drug development, a PFDD meeting with the FDA recently. I was wondering if you could say, you know, if you want to comment on anything Jessica said, or if you could say a few words about how that went and how your partnerships with industry has gone.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, so much of what Jessica just talked about resonates so so highly with the work that we're doing and our mission. We've been working with goal attainment scaling, and our data outcomes has been part of our team. And so we've actually been thinking with them about how we can maybe get a library of things that would apply to DEE trials. That's an amazing individualized measure that has been FDA used in treatments, tests, clinical trials. But then this idea of meaningful change is really, really critically important. And, with MCID, that's something that Jenny Downs is leading on our team and really pushing forward, and really getting that sense of, so it's just this, that where it might be a 10-step to get to, oh, I want my kid to walk. Okay, well, what's stage 1? What does progress look like? And that's really, really important, especially in the frame of a clinical trial, right? We know that 3 months, you're not going to see milestones met by these individuals in that period frame. But what we want to be able to do is measure trajectory. Are they moving in that direction? And then hopefully in the extended phase, you can see that progress continue. And the remote piece is really, really critical as well. We all know, I mean, I can tell you as someone who has to pack up my kid and drive and do all this stuff to get them to the hospital, they are not at their best there. And if you're asking us to tell you what our kids are like day to day, and you'll get a much better sense for that if they can be in their own environment. Because we all know that our kids change from day to day, right? Too. So And so it's just a much more important measure for a lot of our families about how are they doing on a typical day at home. So thank you for letting me kind of insert that onto what Jessica had already said. But in terms of our engagement with FDA, we have been in front of them a lot informally in lots of different ways. You know, we've done a lot of presentations at research roundtables and things like that. And for example, a big LGS meeting where we came and did, a showcase of what we're doing. But more formally, we did have a listening session late last year in November in front of the FDA, which was very well received. And it was incredibly powerful. We had 7 families representing 8 different disorders sharing their journeys. And we were not expecting any questions, any comments, but at the end, we got some really, really positive feedback about from the FDA about the work that we're doing and the way we're doing it across disorders. And there are trends within, I think, the industry scene of doing more cross DEE trials, more trials that are not specifically to one disorder. And we've seen that before, right? With, these different drugs like CBD, Epidiolex, right? It's like it's phased, and then it's 10 years before you get an indication for 3 disorders. And our kids don't have that kind of time. So really pleased with, the sense that both industry and FDA are kind of moving into having some more flexibility and desire to see us get more disorders covered more quickly, because we know that 50% of DEEs don't even have a genetic diagnosis, right? So those families have access to no treatments unless there are, DEE trials. So we're excited to see those happening. And in terms of industry participation, it is a really critically important part of our project. And I'll back up and say, so we basically have our core research team, and then lots of other researchers that we bring in on the basis to help us with certain elements. And then we have a steering committee, which is professionals, clinicians, researchers, many patient advocacy leaders who help guide our work and help us think about what we're doing, how we're doing it, how can we be more successful, what are we forgetting, what's the caregiver and patient perspective here we need to keep in mind. And then we also have an industry advisory panel. And those are for our industry partners who have committed to providing some funds for this project so that we can move it forward. It would not be able to go forward if we did not have those sponsors to help us do this clinical research. And partners of all sizes. We have little guys who have nothing to market, and people and groups who have are quite large. So we make it work for any group that's interested in being a part of it. And they are an active part of industry advisory meetings that we have. Each group gets 2 members from their team to come and sit, and we give updates. We tell them everything that's going on, what we're planning, how we came to these decisions, what we're thinking about doing, and they really are critical in helping us decide how to move forward. We rely on them to help us understand what do they need from their perspective, what's realistic as an industry partner going into a trial, what we have to keep in mind in terms of timeline, in terms of feasibility, and really it's a partnership. So they've we bring everything that we're kind of doing to them, and they give us their guidance and their wisdom. And while we don't do anything just because they say you should do this, as a research team, we take it into account and make sure that what we're doing can be applied to what they're doing, because we want them to be successful, right? I mean, I've heard too many stories of families that have been on trial medications and it's helping and it's working, and then they can't measure, they can't find any measurable change, so the drug disappears and their kid goes back to being, less responsive, less engaged, and that just shouldn't happen. Anyway, so I think that the industry part is really, really critical, and they're helping us think about how we develop this new battery, this new clinical outcome assessment that will be inclusive of communication and everything that goes with it, right? Motor, vision, cognition, awareness, And so, we're always looking for new partners, and we welcome people to reach out to us. Even if you don't want to partner, if you just have questions, this is really a collaborative community effort. We have, more than a dozen patient advocacy groups working with us, and always growing that as well.
Yeah, I just, from somebody who's got decades of experience in clinical research and drug development, I've worked on the drug development side, I've worked on the clinical trial side, I've worked on the advocacy side, and I think you illustrate a really important point, which is that you are the fulcrum for all of this, right? So you are doing the work to understand what patients and families want. You're moving the needle with regulators because, in industry, there's this push-pull tension between industry and regulators, right? Industry will only do what regulators have asked for. Regulators won't ask for it unless industry can provide it, right? So there's this circular logic that goes with it. And that's the role that I see your team in the InSTEM project serving, is you are the fulcrum to both connect industry, right? What are we want to develop an endpoint, but we want to make sure you're going to use it in your trials. So what does it need to look like? You're working with regulators to say, hey, if an industry comes to you with data using this endpoint, are you going to approve their product? Right. And then the community as well, to make sure that their interests are represented in both of those conversations, I think is incredibly powerful. So stump speed for InSTEM project, I mean, it's really difficult. And the fact that you are doing it from a symptomatology standpoint rather than a disease specific standpoint, to Jessica's earlier point, I think is the value in there. Rather than developing therapies for a disease, if we develop a therapy for a symptom that crosses many diseases, there's more patients that are served. And in the rare disease community, the more you can do to increase your target population, the more success, the more likelihood you have for success. I think that's incredibly powerful. Thank you.
Yeah, if I can add,
Please,
Julianne, just one point that has been really valuable for our industry partners is that in addition to these pre-competitive meetings in this industry panel, which is a very productive space for talking about shared challenges, the team has had private meetings with individual companies where in some cases the whole firm shows up, and we have more applied discussions about what we're learning for trials that are in process. They're in phase 2 and they're about to go to phase 3, and we don't have the new instrument yet, but those dialogues and then being prepared for extended use evaluations, which is often important in this field. So it's that opportunity to really join us and be together and partners at the cutting edge of what we're learning, like the GAS, the goal attainment scaling. That's one of the instruments that we've evaluated. We've got 2 specific publications on it with this population, and it's something we're encouraging folks to consider. And it doesn't have to await the full new validated or preliminary validation of a new instrument. So it's those applied meetings on an individual basis, with the CDA, and getting kind of the best and brightest who are at the cutting edge of what you said, capturing what's important to families, what's relevant for the trial, and what is acceptable for regulators.
exactly.
I'll say one last thing too, which is that another thing that industry has really helped us with, or is going to, is that we want to start using this new measures in clinical trials, and we're going to need our partners to help us use them first as probably exploratory measures, and then hopefully secondary measures to test them, see if they do what we want them to do and need them to do. So that's another thing that our industry partners are gearing up to help us with.
For people in our audience that haven't done tool development, I mean, it is way more complicated and time consuming than you would think. And then the corner piece is that validation. And so again, I think that's a really nice opportunity for partnership between advocacy organizations and research organizations like Instone and industry, because you don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? There's already somebody out there who's doing that. Connect with them, get on a board with them, right? Have these practical discussions with them to make sure that what is going to come out is going to be usable or have the data that you need to be able to evaluate whether that tool is appropriate. We did get a question in the chat. This is, I'll tee this up for everybody, right? So groups are still doing one-by-one development of clinical outcomes assessments. Industry is paying for observational trials. Will Instone share their patient-level data for other groups to access and accelerate future innovation? And if that's a question you can't answer now, that's fine. We can follow up later. But Gabi, you or Jay, I have a thought on that.
Yeah, our goal is to put this learning out there to help everyone. We're not in this to, do anything except help the end users, which is our children and loved ones and families, and support more effective medications and treatments coming to market. I think the technicalities of all of it, we're still working out, but and certainly we're already sharing some of the data with our patient advocacy group partners as well. So when we have specific data, from our the survey that we did, we had 5 groups or 6 groups, I believe, where there were over 20 caregivers who participated, and that kind of data we're giving back to those communities so they can use it to guide the work that they're doing in their communications with industry about these critical issues. Jada, do you want to add anything to that?
Sharing the data. The key thing is that we're publishing everything. So while publications may not feel like a way of data sharing, there is, as I said, 4 articles that were published based on that 2A pilot. So very detailed results are already being shared. And then based on the Parent Speak survey with the 260 individuals across 24 etiologies, there are 5 papers under publication. So as Gabi said, our commitment, we're not selling the data, we're not trying to have this as a revenue generator. That the data is going out there in certainly the form appropriate given the personalized data, and then the more personal, specific, as Gabi said, for individual patient groups, that's being shared with those partners.
And if anybody has, feel free to reach out to us if there's people who are interested to learn more. We'd be happy to talk with anybody about what we're doing and what we have, and if and how we might share something that would be helpful to the work they're doing.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we're sharing a 1-page summary that has links to different things like the 6 groups that have had the data aggregated. That's been published on our website, high level of that, but you'll see what the 6 groups are, and we're working with some researchers on those specific diseases to share that data. But our main conclusion is doing more and more of this across disorders. So it's not so much to have it fuel more one-on-one development of instruments, but really support the essential necessity really for cross-disease tools when there are 800 identified genes of DEEs, and each group is and each trial on a specific disease can't do this again and again and again.
Exactly, and it's a waste. We're going to move into the Q&A portion. I want to encourage our attendees to submit your questions into the little chat widget that should be available to you through your toolbar on the XTalks platform. You should also be able to see their two handouts. One is the one-pager from Inchstone that Jayetta just referenced. The second is a download of the slides from today, including a list of references from both the Inchstone project and from Jessica's own research. So for our listeners, if you can download those things, and they'll be available as well as this recording after the conclusion of the webinar. Talk to me a little bit about CPATH. Gabi and Jayetta and Jessica as well would love to know if you guys work with CPATH, either as Inchstone, as DEEP, or as the SCN8A community.
Jada, why don't you take that one? I think you've been.
Our first contact has been on the SCN8A side because we have a 9-year registry of longitudinal data, and as you know, one of their primary missions is really coordinating and consolidating data. So that is our first interface. We have talked with folks. We know they are actually developing some instruments, and as our partnership with FDA it deepens, we would like to explore how we can be more involved. They have some working groups that we know are focusing on this topic, and we know people who are on it, but we are not. And we would welcome an opportunity because it is, from a regulator point of view, it's really their view of the cutting edge of outcome measurement is going on in part of their activities.
Mm-hmm. Jessica, have you worked with CPATH at all, or?
Yeah, I started working with CPATH actually when it first started. I was doing some clinical trials and work in Angelman syndrome, and worked with them and contributed data. And so I've worked with many different sections as I've progressed through drug development in different disorders. Duchenne muscular dystrophy is one of them as well. And I think CPATH is incredibly powerful. For one thing, these working groups, as Jayetta mentioned, are in collaboration with FDA. So CPATH is funded by FDA. And so they have different directors for each disorder that they have working groups for. So Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, they have they have some lysosomal storage disease work going on now. So if you join these meetings, they're talking about trying to develop some of these clinical outcome assessments or biomarkers that could be helpful for either one specific disorder or across multiple disorders. And you get that feedback, and FDA is in the loop about what are people thinking about, and they're able to actively give feedback. The other place that's incredibly valuable is that and I encourage groups to share their data with CPATH and form that connection, because as you form that connection and more data is available through CPATH, I've seen them be very proactive in utilizing that data to create data sets. And what we want to see particularly with rare disorders and developmental epileptic encephalopathies, is that we're able to develop data sets where we have synthetic controls, that we have a natural comparator cohort for our clinical trials, so that we don't have to do placebo-controlled trials. We can just compare to data that's already been collected and available. And so for DMD, for example, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, they have a platform where they're really working on developing these synthetic control curves to be able to support industry and families to get these drugs to them. So I think it's incredibly powerful and an important partner for people to be thinking about.
Agree. And from my own experience in attending those meetings, I could say, as somebody who's a tactician, right, my job is to put it into practice. They can get really technical, and you can imagine the challenge in trying to harmonize data across different data sets. And so hearing sort of the strategy for that, I find deeply thrilling, but there's also strategic conversations that are helpful to listen to as well. So a little plug there for CPATH. I think that is a great place to put a pin in things for today. Again, I really appreciate and and I'm grateful to our speakers to come out and share your experience with us. And I hope that our audience learned a lot more about it's not just seizures anymore. Go to ask your communities. Don't reinvent the wheel. Connect with groups like Inchstone. Connect with experts like Jessica, who's been there and done that. So really, hope to make some connections between our speakers today as a resource for our attendees who were able to listen in. And with that, Sonia, I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Julianne, for being my co-moderator for today. And thank you, Gabi, Jessica, and Jayetta for answering all those questions. We have reached the end of the Q&A portion of the webinar, as Julianne has just mentioned. And if we couldn't attend to your questions, the team at Worldwide Clinical Trials will follow up with you after this presentation. And if you have any further questions, please direct them to the email addresses you see there on your screen. And there's also a QR code that you can utilize. And then here are some links here that you can grab. And remember, there are those handouts at the handouts tab that you can pick up, and we have 2 there for you. Thank you, everyone, for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen. Your participation is appreciated, as it will help us to improve on our further webinars. Now, I'm going to send the link now for today's recording that you can share with your colleagues. I'm going to put that in the chat box there now, and you should see it appear. And there you go, everyone. Okay, now please join us in thanking our speakers for their time here for today. So thank you, Jayetta, Gabi, and Jessica, and again, Juliana, for co-moderating. We hope you found this webinar informative. It has been my pleasure to be your co-moderator for today's event. On behalf of the team here at X-Talks, we thank you for joining us. Until next time, I'm Sonia Hunt. Please take care, and bye for now. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.